It's never been easier to become a guru. You don't need insight. You don't need originality. You just need to memorize your lines. Repeat after me. You are not who you think you are. You are not your brain. You are not your thoughts. All the ideas you have about your identity, your gender, your social class, your strengths and weaknesses, even your name. These are not actually you. You are what's left when you empty yourself of these concepts. You are the observer of the thoughts. You are pure awareness. You are the universal consciousness which pervades all beings. Congratulations. You are now a certified spiritual teacher. You are qualified to teach the same message that everyone else is teaching. It's not just mystics. It's Silicon Valley. It's self-help. Self-transcendence transcends all other advice. It's the untouchable prescription. But is it right? Psychitects, thank you for joining me as we explore the many ways to optimize our psychological software together. Today we're exploring the concept of the self, the Eastern notion of nonself and ego transcendence, and the form of enlightenment espoused by teachers like Eckhart Tolle. We hear a lot about this idea that the self is an illusion these days. It's everywhere in Buddhist teaching, it's seeped into popular culture, and it's become more common in best-selling self-help books than swear words. But is it true, or just an outdated religious myth? And if it is true, what can we actually do with this information? The Buddhist belief called anatta, or non-self, states that the concept of the self is entirely an illusion. When we look inside our minds, what we find is a series of thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that are ever-changing and out of our control. What we call a being or an individual or I, according to Buddhist philosophy, is only a combination of evolving physical and mental forces or energies, which may be divided into 5 groups or aggregates. Walpola Rahula, what the Buddha taught. The properties we seem to associate with selfhood are continuity and control. And a strong argument can be made that what we often call I actually has neither of these properties. Because of the constant evolution and flux occurring in our brains, the person you think you are today is an entirely different entity from who you were 10 years ago or even 10 seconds ago. You are not a stable and unified being, but an ongoing and constantly evolving set of processes. Ancient Buddhist teacher Nagasena uses the example of a house to demonstrate the illusory nature of the self. Just as the word house is but a mode of expression for wood and other constituents of a house, surrounding space in a certain relation, but in the absolute sense there is no house, when we come to examine the parts one by one, we discover that in the absolute sense there is no tree. In the exact same way, the words living entity and ego are but a mode of expression for the presence of the 5 attachment groups. But when we come to examine the elements of being one by one, we discover that in the absolute sense, there is no living entity there to form a basis for such figments as I am or I. In other words, that in the absolute sense, there is only name and form. Furthermore, it becomes clear when we carefully examine our own thoughts that we have little to no control over them. We can't choose or even predict which thought we are going to have next. And you can't simply decide not to think about Gwyneth Paltrow when I say her name, no matter how much you would prefer not to. The Buddha was far ahead of his time and asserted truths that would only be confirmed by neuroscience millennia later. The idea that there is a monolithic executive underlying all your actions and decisions has been debunked. Your thoughts, emotions, and actions are all determined by a multitude of bottom-up processes, merely leaving you with the impression that you were in control of it all along. Like any good multi-level marketing company, your brain makes you feel like you're in control of your own destiny and then shames you for your failures. And it does make sense that evolution would have built us with this sense of singular autonomy. In Why Buddhism is True, Robert Wright says, in short, from natural selection's point of view, it's good for you to tell a coherent story about yourself, to depict yourself as a rational, self-aware actor. So whenever your actual motivations aren't accessible to the part of your brain that communicates with the world, it would make sense for that part of your brain to generate stories about your motivation. Much of the pain we experience is caused not by events we wish to avoid, but by the identity we wish to have. The desires which cause us to suffer when we're hit with a painful insult are the desires to be a competent, lovable, and valued individual. And by contemplating non-self, we can get distance from our identity-based desires by reminding ourselves of the flaws with the entire self-construct when circumstances clash with these desires to be liked or respected. There is some evidence that reflecting less on our personal life narratives can mitigate suffering. A decrease in narrative self-thoughts has been found to decrease negative emotion. And self-critical rumination is a completely pointless exercise that we seem to engage in just to torture ourselves. It's like scrolling through Zillow in 2024. Too real? It does seem possible, at least theoretically, to get rid of your sense of self and live in a state of perpetual present through years of disciplined meditation. And sure enough, many forms of suffering would go along with it. Our brains don't seem to have any properties we attribute to selfhood, so the most logical conclusion is that a selfless worldview is more accurate. And it certainly seems that getting rid of our egos would make us happier beings, right? But there's one question I find myself asking of this prescription to lose yourself. A question that is almost never asked of this now popular narrative of ego transcendence. Is anything lost when we transcend our egos? The rather bold stance I've taken is that the ego, or the self-concept, self-esteem, identity, it plays a critical role in human well-being. I happen to think that the illusion of self-identity, though it is responsible for despair, is also responsible for true happiness and flourishing. Think about the greatest, happiest periods of your life. What do they have in common? A few particular years of my life stand out, and at the risk of sounding narcissistic, I'll tell you what they all have in common. I truly loved myself, in a sense I believe is exceedingly healthy. I was thrilled to get to wake up each day and be myself. When I thought about me, that great illusion of the self, positive thoughts and emotions came to mind. The exact opposite is true of the worst periods of my life. There have been times when I had no strong sense of self, particularly in the periods when I was meditating regularly. I had managed to weaken my identity, as these practices often encourage. You could say I became less vain in a sense. I found myself looking in the mirror less than ever. But I would not describe it as wholly positive. It didn't make me happier. It made me more neutral. And evidence from positive and clinical psychology suggests that the most deeply satisfied people in the world don't have no sense of self. They have a strong, positive sense of self. High self-esteem is strongly linked to life satisfaction and inversely correlated with depression. And Martin Seligman's research indicates that the happiest people are those who are exercising their greatest strengths on a daily basis and evaluate themselves and their virtues positively. The ancient Greeks believed that the highest form of happiness, or the good life, was a state called Eudaimonia. It was the highest and happiest mental state a person could achieve. I know it's a big, exotic word, and it's pretty annoying of me to expect you to remember it, but there simply isn't another word in the English language that captures its meaning. Eudaimonia referred to a specific kind of well-being, the kind of happiness we get from being a person of whom we ourselves highly approve. Yes, this ultimate form of satisfaction the ancients proposed was inherently self-centered. It was not just a matter of feeling good. It was a matter of feeling good about yourself, and justifiably so. For the purpose of this argument, let's say that overall well-being runs from -1 to 1. We would characterize -1 as severe depression. 1 represents peak eudaimonia. I propose that the state of self-transcendence is effectively 0. And there is no doubt it would feel like absolute bliss for anyone who arrived at it from below. But this state would also represent the cessation of identity-related joy and flourishing. Psychological well-being is the product of living in alignment with your own values. The self-concept is the engine of well-being. By removing your ego, your sense of self, your identity, you take the batteries out of the happiness-unhappiness machine. By transcending your ego, if you could achieve such a feat, you would cut yourself off from the deep despair that results from failing to align with your own values. But you would also cut yourself off from the eudaimonia that results from aligning with them. In The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle says, "The mind is a superb instrument if used rightly. Used wrongly, however, it becomes very destructive." To put it more accurately, it is not so much that you use your mind wrongly, you usually don't use it at all. It uses you. This is the disease. You believe that you are your mind. This is the delusion. The instrument has taken you over. At the start of his best-selling spiritual manifesto, The Power of Now, New Age guru Eckhart Tolle tells the story of his enlightenment. He had struggled with anxiety and suicidal depression his whole life, but he begins his enlightenment story in his late 20s. He woke up in the middle of the night so full of self-loathing and misery that he decided he could no longer live with himself. This phrase and the seemingly paradoxical nature of not being able to live with oneself launched him into a life-altering experience. He realized the illusory nature of the self in a deep, experiential way. He transcended his ego. He went from -1 to 0. He then spent the next few years living a free-floating existence without a care in the world, sitting on park benches and listening to birds chirp. He had no relationships, no job, no home, no socially defined identity. In the process of writing his book, sharing his ideas, and becoming a guru, I imagine Eckhart went through yet another powerful positive shift. He had, intentionally or not, constructed a new identity for himself. He was no longer the miserable and unremarkable man he had been before. He was enlightened. He was a guru. He was a best-selling author. His ideas were so valuable that people would travel across the world to hear him speak. He went from 0 to 1. I want to point out here that I love Eckhart Tolle's work. Reading The Power of Now has a truly therapeutic effect for me. And if you haven't already read it, I highly recommend that you get a copy. But I don't think it's likely he lives without a sense of identity today. I would propose that Tolle untranscended his ego. He lost it, and then he found it again. I'm sure he experiences some cognitive dissonance as he praises freedom from selfhood while enjoying his own strong, positive sense of self. But it's not enough to take him back to his park bench existence. This type of enlightenment is for people who are so unhappy with themselves that having no self would be far better than living with their current self. And sure enough, Tolle says he was already suicidal at the age of 8. If you're one of these people, it is possible that a journey of ego transcendence could be beneficial for you. But I want to assure you that non-self and misery are not your only two options. Ego transcendence is like that guy holding a huge fish in his dating app profile. It's impressive and all, but I think you can do better. It's possible to construct and affirm that positive identity for which you long. Don't get me wrong, I believe there is immense value in metacognitive awareness, practices like mindfulness meditation, and experiences that reveal the illusory nature of self. In fact, I regard them as prerequisite steps for personal growth. Trying to improve your mind without becoming aware of it first is like trying to sell 1 million copies of your new book when you don't even have 2,000 YouTube subscribers, right? But these mindfulness practices are useful not because they help you permanently transcend your sense of self, but because they give you greater clarity, awareness, and capacity to design a better self. The source of your problems is not your ego. The solution to your problems is not to eliminate or weaken your sense of self. Your sense of self is your greatest source of strength and satisfaction. Your sense of self is your superpower. Increase it. Strengthen it. Get as much self as you can. Don't transcend it, except temporarily, so as to better strengthen it in the long run. Let's think about this through a quick thought experiment. Imagine it's a freezing cold night and your heater suddenly quits working. But even worse, it starts blowing out freezing cold air and you don't seem to be able to stop it. Before long, it's going to be colder inside than it is outside. You don't know anything about HVAC repair, and your internet and cell service are out, so you can't Google it or call someone. You have to think quickly. You realize you have two options. First, you can open things up and attempt to tinker your way to fixing the heating component. This will force you to stand right in front of the freezing air, and there's no guarantee you'll be able to figure it out. Second, you can take your trusty baseball bat and start smashing. True, if you destroy the unit, you are guaranteed not to get any warm air, but at least you won't have to deal with the freezing air, and you'll probably make it through the night without turning into a human ice sculpture. What would you do? This is essentially how I view the conundrum of the ego, and likely the default mode network in the brain. It is possible for our sense of self to take on a very negative state, either due to the lack of character we're exhibiting or a distorted mechanism for judging ourselves. And these issues can result in low self-esteem, extremely negative ruminations about ourselves, and depression. But it's also possible for us to become the kind of person who we so highly approve of, who we so deeply admire that we get to reap the benefit of extreme eudaimonia. This self-appraisal system in our brains has the power to deliver either fulfillment or misery to us. And this means we all face a difficult decision. Do we attempt to tinker with our sense of self and try to make it put out the most pleasant heat, happiness, or do we simply smash it to pieces to cut our losses and put an end to the cold air of despair? Do we try to make it so that we approve of what we observe when we think about ourselves, or do we just try to make the thoughts stop? What do you think? Should we try to disable our egos and transcend ourselves, or should we work to build the best self we can?